Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us. You are watching the show for the adventurous wine drinker, and we are Anu and Igor. We're the owners and founders of Vinousreverie Wine Merchant out in Walnut Creek, California. And we've got a little wine shop, and our mission is, what's our mission?
To bring the best wines in the world to you guys.
Awesome. Yes, best value wines, unique wines from all over the world. So this is our show, and today we've got a special. We've got a guest joining us, Larry Dennen, and excuse my inability to multitask while I invite them in. Introduce himself, and we'll talk about the wines we're going to taste in just a little bit. In theory.
Yeah.
There you are.
There he is.
Hi. How are you, Larry?
Yes, doing fine. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Well, Larry, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and let us know how you got into wine?
Oh, that's a long story.
The short version.
I'll give you the shortened version, okay? Essentially, I started with a bunch of friends, a small wine importing business as a sort of a hobby. It was back in 2004. Enjoyed it tremendously, did it to meet the people, etc. But it's sort of, as Shannon says now, it's a hobby that's gotten way out of control.
Yeah, I know that.
So it's gotten a little bit bigger than it used to be, but it's still a lot of fun. Still tremendously enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, cool. Thanks for joining our show. And do you want which one should we showcase first?
Larry, I think before we start with the wines, can you kind of give us a little overview of Burgundy? And I have my trusty map with us. So
you have your map.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple of things. There's like the greater Burgundy that some people lump in Chablis and Beaujolais. Chablis from the north, Beaujolais from the south. But I think like the main part of Burgundy, there's like four regions. So if you could give us like a little overview, just to summarize for somebody not familiar with Burgundy.
All right, so let me give you a thumbnail sketch. All right, and let me start with saying that in France, we'll start with the map. So you're right, there's multiple regions. It starts in the north, actually closer to Paris than you would want to believe, with Chablis, making almost exclusively white wines. Then as you go further south to Dijon, you start to run into the Côte d'Or, or the Golden Slope. And the Golden Slope is the heart of Burgundy. Probably what we know Burgundy of is from the wines produced in that area. It's divided into two areas, Côte de Nuit, for black grapes originally, and the Côte de Beaune, which is from Beaune going south almost to the town of Couchy. Then further south from there, some areas we see a lot of wines from, but we don't usually think of as Burgundy, is the Côte Chalonnaise. And then subsequently, even further south towards Mâcon is Mâconnaise. And so a lot more wine in terms of volume is made in the Côte Chalonnaise and Côte Mâconnaise. But the reputation is built off of the white and red wines that come from the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune. Interestingly, the way the French label their wines is very different than the United States. So here you buy by varietal. You pick up a bottle and it says Chardonnay and then where it comes from. But in France, they bottle by appellation or location. And so as a general rule of thumb, you can pretty much say that white Burgundies are Chardonnay and red Burgundies will be Pinot Noir. There are a few indigenous grapes like César and Aligoté, and a little bit of Pinot Blanc, a mutation actually of Pinot Noir, that you can find, but rarely in American markets. So just stick to the rule of thumb. A white wine has got to be Chardonnay and a red wine is going to be Pinot Noir.
Very cool. Yeah. So I have the reverse map.
Okay. There's more.
So Côte de Beaune, you were saying. So we're going to be tasting the village from Volnay, which is right like in the center of Côte de Beaune. So I don't know. It's right here. So and Larry, can you speaking of some, the two main regions, Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuit. There's a lot of villages within those two regions. but some are more reputable than others. Is there like general statements you could say about why a village like Volnay might be more reputable than a village like Marsanne, or just as an example?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really hard one to answer, but I think it gets to this. There are, in France you have, or in Burgundy, you have village level wines, Bourgogne, etc., which come from the general region, can be blends. You have premier crus, which are, or Ludwig, which are named vineyards with good reputations. Then you have the premier crus, and then you have the grand crus. And in short, about 1% of it's grand cru, 10% of it's premier cru, and 25% of it are named vineyards. And the balance is mostly wine, comes from the area that's blended. And I think what's happened over time is those very well-known Grand Cru vineyards and the area that they come from are what's been imported to the United States and what we've learned of and hear of. And so the second thing I think is size. Some of these villages produce a lot more wine than others. We've heard of Gevrey-Chambertin because it produces a large amount of wine. Meursault or Pommard, they all produce large quantities and they're common in the US marketplace. I think the smaller appellations, although I think the wines from some of them are really spectacular, we just don't get very familiar with, and so we don't know them. And last, I think we speak English, not French, and those words that are easier for us to hear, I think we sometimes actually have a little gravity to tendency to buy them. So we know them a little bit more. But each village, largely down through the heart of Burgundy, has its name associated with vineyards and therefore has the ability to label wines with their name on them. I think the other thing that I'm sure you'll ask me sooner or later is Volnay is situated between those two large communes. To the south is Meursault and to the north is Pommard. Pommard is largely a red wine producing area, and Meursault is largely a white wine producing area, and Volnay produces only red wines in the middle. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that there's no Grand Crus in Volnay. And if you look at a map of where the vineyards are located, you'll start to see that all the finest vineyards, the Grand Crus or the Premier Crus, occur in the middle of the slopes. They're not at the top and they're not at the bottom. And that's largely about why the better quality wines come from that area have to do with the exposure of the layers of rock in those areas. So the area of Bourgogne is largely a big shelf of limestone. And as the Alps and Pyrenees formed, it created enough pressure that it actually folded in this and made this ridge or dropped the valley. And on the slope, therefore, you actually have cut across many, many layers of rock. So the tops tend to have very sandy, very thin topsoil mixed with the limestone. And as you go down the slope, you get more and more sediment, richer soils and clays that have washed down through the years. So the kinds of wines that come and how the grapes grow in that slope is very, very different. So in Volnay, what occupies the middle of that slope are the Premier Cru vineyards. You do not have any Grand Crus, so I don't think it's quite as well known as its neighbors, Meursault and Pommard.
Okay, that was one of my questions that I had for Igor beforehand. I was wanting to know how you discovered this particular winery, or in general, like how did you guys, discover producers? What did you look for when you're trying to figure out who to import?
Well, I think that's something that's changed. That's been an evolution and has changed over time. When we first went in 2004, we were really looking for who wasn't imported that would sell us wine, and then over time we started to discover what fits the profile of what we like and what we want. But probably more importantly, how do we get synergy with the producer and what we want? So we would look for who has holdings in what areas, therefore what wines we could acquire from them. We'd look to see what their production is. We like small family-run wineries. I got involved in this really because I like the people and I like interacting with the people. And so big corporations weren't really a very good match for our interest. We like mostly producers that own their own vineyards, because I really believe that wine is made in the vineyard, and all the producers can do is mess it up with time. So starting with good raw material or raw product is what comes out with a good product. And then they can't be too large. We're a relatively small company, so if you're making 1.5 million bottles, you're going a national distributor who's going to be able to buy a huge quantity off of you. And you want the relationship to be long-term, and you want the relationship to benefit both of you. So we look for people who made 50,000, 75,000 bottles. So over time, it changed a little bit, and what we were looking for changed. How did we find this particular producer, Pascal and Rayanne Boulet? Well, there's a couple of famous families, first of all, from Volnay, and they turned out to be one of them. It is not the only Boulet from Volnay. You'll find Thomas Boulet makes wines that's on the markets here in the United States. They export a sizable amount of wine also. But we actually were at dinner, and we ask, usually when we eat there, we talk to the sommelier and we say, make a recommendation for what. And from that, we get to taste things that we wouldn't normally know of, we wouldn't normally know anything about. And that's how we actually came up with and met them. The Somm happened to know this family. He poured their wine for us for dinner. We said, wow, that's really what I think of as Volnay. Elegant, soft, and has enough acidity to be interesting, but not overpowering tannins that clashes with the food. And so we said, well, do you happen to know them at all? And he says, yeah, sure. So called and said, how about if you go by tomorrow, which is a Saturday. Never expected to have an appointment on a Saturday, but that's how it worked out. They were located right in the heart of Volnay, across from the church. We wandered around the town for a while thinking we're going to see a winery. Instead, it looks like you're looking at the front of their house, and not until you go in and go, it sort of is a courtyard, and it opens up into a series of buildings. So we met them. She greeted us with little cheese puffs, which immediately made me like her wine more than I would have otherwise. And we sat down and had a long tasting and great conversation. They're really nice people. And then subsequently, we had to pass the test. And we joked about the test for years afterwards. And so Pascal took us to the cellar where none of the bottles are labeled.
Okay.
And he would open a bottle and say, what do you think it is? And then we would have to play the game of tell him what we thought it was and from what vintage it came from.
Wow.
Apparently, we got enough of them correct to pass the test, and actually had the opportunity to start, therefore, to import their wines, which we have done since 2004. Subsequent to that, although the domain is now largely run and the wines are largely made by their son, Peric. And with the dad's sort of helpful hand and advice. And some of the stories are sometimes that's very helpful, and sometimes I'm not sure it's wanted advice. But nonetheless, they work at it together to turn out a product. And I think the wines have changed a little bit in that I think Peric especially is a big fan of a slightly more elegant, lighter style. He has a really nice touch with the wine, and doesn't look for very much extraction. And it's one of the things I don't like is when I see producers who try to make a big, dense Pommard style wine from Volnay, because that's not what it's supposed to be. So So that's how to make. That's how we ended up finding them. That's how we got to know them. They're wonderful people. So.
Oh, that's very nice. And just doing a little background. So Pierrick, he actually won the Young Vigneron of the Year in Bourgogne. I think after 2012. I don't know exactly what year, but that's pretty good. Accolade. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure is. And they choose that someone every year, and you have to realize there's hundreds of domains making wine and families making wine, because Napoleonic law really require, unlike here, where you could say, I'm going to give all my land, the entire farm, to my eldest son, and then he'll be responsible for the family. The law in France is written differently, that all the sons have to have equal parts. And so the result of that is, through generation after generation, you get smaller and smaller fragmented pieces of vineyards, which is why, you go to Clos de Vougeot. We've all heard of it. We know it's a wonderful vineyard, but there's 80 owners in Clos de Vougeot. So there are many, many choices to pick winemaker of the year. And so it is quite a big honor.
Yeah, that is very nice.
Interesting. Yeah. Brought that up. Or you've tasted some wines from someone else that we imported in the past, David Dubin. And 2 years prior to, he was the young winemaker of the year in Burgundy. So.
And very high reputation. I think Dubin, just talking to a lot of people, he's definitely known in the circles, at least in San Francisco area. A lot of people are familiar with that name. So you kind of discovered him.
Well, let's just say we were lucky enough to come across him before he had such a great reputation.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was just reading Jance's review of the Volnay 2018, and she said good wine and a name to watch. So I think it looks like that's 2 for 2 for you.
Yeah. No, I think they make real Volnays, and I really like that. They also have enough Premier Cru vineyards that they have 4 Premier Crus plus a monopole. And so the result of that is that they can get quite a variation in flavor profiles, even from Volnay. So some are more spicy. Some of the vineyards provide more spice. Some ripen early, like Champagne is an early ripening, usually very floral. So each one has its own reputation. Yeah. So they're well. They have to build a new winery, very modern, and that's another thing, you asked me about. And one of the things I'd love to do when we first meet a producer is 2 things. Walk the vineyard with them, because you learn a lot about what they believe in, how they handle the vineyard. Do they use a lot of pesticides? Do they suppress the growth of the grasses between rows or not? And you learn a lot about their philosophy of how they handle their vineyards, what their crop yields are, how they limit those. I think that's always useful. And the second thing I love the least the first time we go, they always want to go to the cellar, the barrel cellar. And that's, trust me, I enjoy going to taste the wines. But I am also interested in their wine production facility, because how clean are they? How do they actually maintain the spaces, etc.? And many of the wineries in France, believe it or not, although they're in buildings built in the 1500s or 1600s, are incredibly clean. And it's really quite amazing the tremendous attention they pay to the detail in the cellars.
Well, that's definitely very interesting. You mentioned something about passing the test earlier on. So what was the test? Were you supposed to guess which of the Premier Cru vineyards the wines came from?
Yeah, there was a couple choices of what Premier Cru. There was one, because they do own some Montpellier. And so one of the wines that he put in was a Montpellier Premier Cru. And the only thing you had to get right on that was it wasn't Volnay. And fortunately, I had done my homework overnight the night before and looked up where their holdings were. So I somewhat cheated, I guess. But I had the instincts to know that that was not a Volnay. And so I guessed it was Montpellier, of course, because they own from there. And then, he finished by opening a bottle and saying, "What year is it?" It was a Volnay Village from 1977. And of course, we didn't get the year right. We guessed it was older.
Okay.
But he really was making a point, and that was even a village level wine from his production will hold up to time and is very drinkable, 25 years or 35 years later. So it was very interesting. That was the nature of the test. Yes,
I had a point.
Yes. And Larry, can you define something else? You mentioned, what's a monopole?
It is an area of a vineyard that's named and designated that's only owned by one producer. Okay. And they're extraordinarily rare. They're not very common. And they're usually a clos. And a clos just means it's surrounded by a stone wall that separates it from some of the surrounding vineyard. So it's common that you'll have a clos within another larger vineyard, although sometimes they are completely by themselves also. But it gets back to this inheritance law kind of phenomenon again for why you get little tiny, you only have 2 rows. But if you have a monopole, that's a piece of vineyard that you own and only you will produce from, unless you, of course, sell some of the grapes. So.
Well, so Larry, are you having one of these 2 wines yourself, or are you having something else?
No, I'm having these wines.
All right, so I mean,
it seemed wrong to me to be drinking California Pinot Noir while we're talking about Burgundy. So.
Well, we'll get to that, but I'll give you my thoughts. I was going back and forth. So I think the village level wine, to me, maybe has more tart fruit, whereas the Premier Cru, it feels like maybe it has a little more depth. A little heavier on the palate, and maybe earthier, just kind of on a high level. I don't know if Anna, you have some thoughts, or Larry, how would you describe the tasting notes between the 2 wines? Because both of them are from 2015. Yeah.
Well, I think I'll start with the village level wine, and I'll say, it has great color. It's still a little closed, to be honest. And I have a general rule of thumb about Burgundy. If you taste Burgundies in the first 2 years, they're usually wonderful. And then they go through a phase of where they close and they lose their fruit and they're hard. And I can't really tell you they show their best. And then somewhere about 6 years after they've been bottled, they start to reemerge. And I think the beauty of Burgundy compared to Pinot Noirs from all around the rest of the world is once they've been aged for a while, that bouquet, the fragrance, that when you open that bottle is really spectacular. I do know that most village Volnays are blends of some holdings of grapes from the top of the slope and the bottom of the slope. And that's because the top ones tend to have a lot more acidity. They ripen a little bit slower, and therefore they give a lot more energy to the wine. And you blend it with something growing on more vegetative soils like clay, where you get much deeper, richer, darker fruits. And in this particular vintage of 2015, despite the fact that it's a well-known, highly reputable, one of the better vintages of the last 10 years, they did have problems with hail in the spring of 2015. And the result of that was they lost a lot of the crop at the top. So this village wine is almost all made from the denser grapes coming from the lower parts of the slope. So I think it's a little slower to open. I think it has a little firmer tannins. And I would almost say it has a hint of a spice like cardamom, which usually I associate with not such floral wines, but a little more dense black fruit kind of flavors and wines. And opposing that, you chose the Champagne, which is a great contrast in my mind. And this is a Premier Cru that ripens earlier because its sun exposure is southeast, so it gets much warmer. It's known for being very aromatic and floral. I think this wine shows that. The fruit ripens, so it has a sweet fruit character, not sugary sweet, but it's a ripeness of the fruit. And it's much more open, I think, today when you taste it than what the village level wine is, for the reasons I explained to you. It is a big wine, though, and it's a big wine from a big vintage, and it will be much better if you taste this wine 5 more years from now. I'm absolutely convinced.
That's funny. So Burgundy wines have a bit of a prepubescent phase that we need to emerge from in order to.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, I'm almost shocked at how different they are for a period of time.
So I guess it's, Larry, it's a great transition actually, because, I hear it a lot, and I'm sure you hear it a lot too, for California wine drinkers, Pinot Noir drinkers. A lot of them say just, I don't get Burgundy. I don't understand Burgundy. And do you have kind of thoughts or theories behind that? Because I think that's a very common,
Yeah, what they don't get is the price points, right? And
they're like, why are they so expensive when I don't taste? And they're looking for something. Yeah.
So I think you touch on a whole bunch of issues right there. So I'll just briefly try to respond back to a couple of them. One, we import wine, we sell it, and we drink 96% of it within a couple months.
Yeah.
The result is that if you buy and drink Burgundy that way, I don't think you'll ever truly appreciate it for what it is. And so, like when we import the wines, as Igor knows, I don't have very many 2018s to offer you right now because I'm really wanting to sell the 2014s and 2015s because I think they've gone through that process and are starting to show what they actually can be. Why not California and why Burgundy? Well, there was a time that the price points of Burgundy were outrageous. And for the most famous vineyards, Bonmar, Clos de Bez, DRC, etc., you're absolutely right. The average person can't afford to drink them. And if they do buy them, they save them forever for the double secret special occasion that's going to come up in the future. But the prices from smaller appellations, Lux Corton, Volnay, etc., you can find very reasonably priced wines. And California Pinot, quite honestly, has gotten much more expensive than it used to be. So at this point, there's more price parity, not to the greatest Burgundies, but you can get good quality Burgundies to drink in roughly the same price points that you can Pinot Noirs from California. That said, I'm sure you're going to ask me, do I like California Pinot? And I'll answer you very honestly. I love California Pinot Noir. They're just not the same wine to me. So to me, I want Burgundy when I want Burgundy, and I want Pinot Noir from California when I do. I love the big, rich, ripe fruits. And with some foods, or if I'm sitting around and want to just have a glass of wine, that's spectacular. I want to have cheese and red wine, though, I'll pull Burgundy 100% of the time. So I think they're both good. I think they're very different. The acidity in Burgundy is much greater, therefore has much greater longevity because it's a much colder, cooler climate to grow grapes in than California. We have zero problem with sunny days and ripening fruit, and so we can ripen fruit in every vintage without much trouble. And we have to be worried that the wines don't get too high in sugar and too low in acid that they lose their interest. So.
So Larry, I have maybe like a statement and question, and I want to have your thoughts on it. So I think what you were mentioning is, I think Burgundians say this frequently, right? They say, we don't grow Pinot Noir, we make red Burgundy. And frequently you hear terms like, and these are, I think, from for the most kind of renowned Burgundies, ethereal and profound. And you typically don't hear those terms with Russian River Pinot Noir, whether it's over oaked or if it's a good example of it. So kind of taking those things into consideration, and then the final thing, you were mentioning soil and limestone. Well, does California have the soil to make wines that are profound and ethereal? If you kind of just say like an overarching statement, if you could, maybe that's not an unfair question.
Yeah, you're forcing me to be judgmental now. Let me tell you, I'll share a little story real quick with you. That you brought up this concept of where you taste a Burgundy and it is an experience you never forget. And if you taste enough Burgundy, sooner or later you will have that experience. And I think that's what people are referring to. 1959 Richebourg, at a friend's house, celebrating their firstborn child, was the bottled wine that first made me truly interested in Burgundy. Yeah. Really a passion to seek out more of it and find it again. So I think it's that kind of experience that they're talking about. And when you find one of those finely stored, beautifully aged bottles of wine, and you go, wow, this is something like nothing I've ever tasted before, in terms of complexity and interest, etc. So can California do that? And I'm not sure I know the answer yet. I think there are some appellations that are coming around in making Pinot, like Sonoma Coast, maybe. Some of the small areas down in the Central Coast where they might have the ability to do that. I think Oregon has soil types very, very similar and therefore has that possibility too. Most California vineyards, though, are on much richer soils than the soils of Burgundy. And so I think the wines tend to take on more of the character of the lower on the slope vines that are in Burgundy. And I think if you take some of those wines and compare them to some of the wines made in California, there's a lot more similarities between the two. So do I think we're going to get to Grand Cru status in California? No, I don't think so. I don't think you have the right combination of temperature, climate, and at the same time soil types. But I still think you can make very nice Pinot Noirs in California. Did that answer your question, or did I skip around it?
Well, no, it does answer my question. I think it does answer the question. And what you mentioned is, I've read other, I always reference Jen says, I know she mentioned that it was a white Burgundy that changed her life when she was, a younger woman. And I've read other, like wine professionals, people who write about wine. And yeah, it's Burgundies that make a difference and why they get addicted to the wine. So I hear that over and over. It's I haven't heard the Russian River Pinot yet. So, I think I guess what I asked that question for is because I think part of the problem is the judgment of Paris. Even though you had to do with Cabernets, I think it kind of said that, oh, California makes the best wines, and everybody's running with that. And I think people who casually drink wine, they know about judgment of Paris, and suddenly they're like, oh, California is the best. Why even try something else? And it's funny because Stephen Spurrier just passed away a couple of weeks ago. He's the gentleman who did the Judgment of Paris. And he was saying how he adored French wines. So I'm sure even to a degree, he himself kind of regrets doing the Judgment of Paris, because I think he did a disservice to a lot of the old world wines, not just French wines, And I think many of the wines that California kind of won the tasting with, California doesn't even make them anymore the same way.
They made in a different style now.
It's made in a different style, so that you wouldn't win anything. So I think it's kind of this kind of marketing, just kind of that's cluttering people's minds and making these false assumptions about wines in one favor versus the other.
Yeah. And I'll say this too, I think we have to keep in the back of our mind that you have good wines and not so good wines from California. Yeah. And you have some good wines and really awful wines from Burgundy too. Yeah. And I've tasted both. So you start doing comparisons, you have to be careful because there's a natural bias in what you select and pick to actually put in that. And that tasting was redone. The Reynaud Society redid that tasting 10 years later. And the French defended their position after the tasting, saying, but our wines will age and the California wines will not. That was sort of the argument. And I'm not surprised that you put Bordeaux up against California cabs, and if you're in a blind tasting, which I enjoy. The fruit is so much riper. The density of the wine is so much more prevalent when they're young that I'm not at all surprised that it turned out that way. You see this once in a while in blind tastings at your own house, where someone brings a fairly inexpensive bottle of something and it tastes great that day and everyone picks it as their number one wine, and you go, oh, how could that possibly be true? But it's about timing, and it's about how the wine's made, how it's structured, and how you select it. And are you really comparing an apple to an apple, or are you comparing two different things? So you can construct it any way you want. But the interesting thing that I found about that tasting was when it was redone, is that the California wines didn't do as well. There was some element of truth that the French wines did age nicely and a lot scored higher than the original. But the good news was that, to me, a bunch of the California Cabernets still scored very well. So it wasn't like they washed away and they were no good anymore. That simply was not true. I like the Paris tasting, not because I think it shows us one's better than the other, because in my humble belief is, and you do this all the time for your customers, you do this all the time in your store, you select wines for what they taste like. You select wines that are different and unique, that you don't get everywhere else and you wouldn't know about otherwise, with an interest to teach people about them and show them the high quality that can come from that. So I see this sort of the same way. I say to people, it's not about picking one or the other. One's better, one's worse. It's what do you enjoy, and taste it. And then tell me if you enjoy it or not. So I think it's like art a little bit,
Yes. Not quite objective, but these lovely, elegant,
very meaningful to her, and I'm like, I don't see anything. So.
Well, yeah, and I think that what I brought it up is to me, it's there's narratives, and a lot of people like to create narratives. And for example, you mentioned like Napa Cab, that kind of exploded, right? And as you said in the retasting, Ridge Vineyards won with Montebello, which is not a Napa Cab; it's a Santa Cruz Cab. So, right. So there's all these tiny details that when you market the wines, you don't want to tell people the details. You want to give them overarching statements. And a lot of people recently, Eric Asimov in the New York Times and other writers have said, hey, Santa Cruz might be the best wine growing region in California, not Napa. But that's not, Napa doesn't want to hear that. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of this details that I think hides the truth, or not truth, but hides the whole story.
Yeah. No, and you're absolutely right. There's so many options and choices. You can create almost any store you want.
Yeah.
If you want to. And I think in a way, that's one of the reasons why the French labeling system makes it a little bit easier. You actually know not just, you know who's producing the wine, and you know from where it's produced, as opposed to in California, I don't think we have that level of sophistication. You just know it's Pinot Noir or Cabernet, etc. So it's a very different construct I think you have to be thinking about when you're buying it.
So you talked about producer's name, the region it comes from, year. That's the, yeah.
It doesn't say anywhere, nowhere on that label does it say Pinot Noir.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but the American consumer now wants to see Pinot Noir in big letters, you know, first, so it's a bit different.
Well,
yeah.
The consumers will change with time, and I think those of us who are trying to sell wine have a purpose, and part of that purpose is education, and that level of being able to explain that and get someone interested in seeing something else. One of the reasons I love Burgundy, quite honestly, is I learn every day. Just when you think you've learned something, you find an exception to the rule. There's another subtlety you never knew, no one ever told you before, and so it's an ever-changing and constantly changing region that I just find it to be interesting in the pursuit of the intellectual component of it.
Yes.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
You're ever changing, constantly changing.
Well, I think that's the cool thing about the wine world in general as well. It's, you know, if you have an open mind and curiosity, you can find much more to explore and to taste. And these are excellent, very elegant and sophisticated wines. So
we enjoy them a lot. Larry, you know, we always love talking with you. Thank you for doing this show with us. I learn a lot all the time, and I think, you know, whoever's watching this will learn a lot too. And I think you, to a part, demystified Burgundy, but I think some of the fun is the mystery of Burgundy. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it's been a real pleasure joining you.
All right. Thanks so much, Larry. You have a great night. Appreciate it.
Good night, everybody.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody. Talk to you guys next Friday.